When you think about professional wrestling, you think about WWE. You think about WCW, even though it was only around for about 13 years. You think about ECW, a company that changed wrestling forever despite lasting only about 9 years. Over the years, wrestling promotions have come and gone. Some had billionaire owners. Some were run by people considered among the brightest minds the business has ever known. Yet one promotion that rarely enters that conversation has quietly been around for more than 26 years. It has outlived promotions with bigger budgets, bigger audiences, and far more exposure. It was started by lifelong wrestling fans who had just happened to become the Insane Clown Posse, a promotion that Violent J has poured his heart and soul into. Former WWF head writer Vince Russo once compared Violent J's work ethic to Vince McMahon's, a compliment that he doesn't hand out lightly. So how has Juggalo Championship Wrestling survived for more than 26 years while hundreds of other promotions have disappeared? That's the story I'm about to tell. Long before there was a JCW, there were 3 kids who could not get enough of professional wrestling. Joe Bruce, who you may know as Violent J, first became friends with John Utzler after both of their families moved to the same neighborhood outside of Detroit, Michigan. Through John, Joe met his younger brother Joey, who you may know as Shaggy 2 Before long, the 3 of them were inseparable, and wrestling became the center of everything they did. Joe started watching during the build-up to the first WrestleMania. As he got older, he went back and learned about the wrestlers and territories that came before it, but his earliest memories were tied to the WWF boom of the 1980s. He gravitated toward larger-than-life personalities like the Ultimate Warrior and the Road Warriors. It wasn't just the matches that pulled him in, it was the entrances, the face paint, the presentation, and the feeling that these people were bigger than life. One of Joe's first live wrestling memories came at Detroit's Joe Louis Arena. The main event featured Andre the Giant and the Junkyard Dog against Big John Studd, King Kong Bundy, and Bobby Heenan. Years later, Joe admitted he remembered the atmosphere just as much as the wrestling itself. For a kid who had only watched these people on television, finally seeing them in person felt larger than anything he had ever imagined. Joe, Joey, and John became regulars around the arena. Even when they couldn't afford tickets, they'd ride the bus downtown carrying autograph books, hoping to catch wrestlers arriving through the back entrance. Sometimes they'd even offer to carry the luggage, just for the chance to spend a few seconds talking to someone they had watched on television. Years later, after ICP appeared alongside the WWF, Joe and Joey found themselves standing at that very same entrance. They looked around for kids doing exactly what they used to do. It reminded them how lucky they had been to live those moments. Watching wrestling eventually was not enough. Joe was around 14 and Joey a couple of years younger. Together they built a wrestling ring in their backyard using 4 railroad posts they found near the train tracks. They hauled the posts home, buried them deep in the ground with sledgehammers, drilled holes through them, and ran old garden hose between the posts for ring ropes. Carpet covered the ground inside of the ring. It wasn't much to look at, but it worked. Joe later joked these posts were driven so far into the ground they're probably still there today. Every Saturday they handed out homemade flyers around the neighborhood and invited people to free wrestling shows. They came up with gimmicks, booked matches, and created storylines. Joe has said he was writing wrestling cards and programs as a teenager, long before he ever promoted a real event. For the 2 of them, becoming professional wrestlers wasn't a dream, it was the plan. At 17, Joe lied about his age and claimed he had already attended wrestling school, so promoters would book him on independent shows throughout the Midwest. His character was Corporal Daryl Daniels. The gimmick wasn't complicated. Joe's brother Rob was serving in the military and mailed army gear home. Joe needed ring attire, so he put it on and became a military character, even though he later admitted the long mullet sticking out of the back probably wasn't very convincing. Joey worked beside him as his manager. The independent scene had introduced them to wrestlers they had grown up idolizing. Joe's very first show was headlined by the Sheik against Bobo Brazil. Both were legends, but also past their prime. Joe remembered Bobo needing help getting to the ring and using the ropes to keep himself standing. The Sheik would patiently sell each punch long enough for Bobo to recover before the next exchange. It wasn't the match Joe had imagined as a kid, but he also understood something few people ever get to say. The first professional wrestling card he was on was headlined by the Sheik and Bobo Brazil. The locker room also included younger wrestlers beginning their own careers. Sabu, Al Snow, Rob Van Dam. Joe became friendly with Sabu and Van Dam, friendships that naturally brought him around the Sheik himself. The Sheik stayed in character almost constantly. Joe remembered one late night stop at Denny's where the Sheik saw a buy one get one free special and insisted the waitress only bring him the free meal. As the argument kept going, Joe sat quietly hoping nobody at the table became the target of the Sheik's temper. Those road trips also exposed Joe to the realities of independent wrestling, long drives and small paydays, promoters who sometimes couldn't pay at all, veteran wrestling's protecting their spots while younger wrestlers fought for opportunities. Joe and Joey loved wrestling. They didn't just love the business surrounding it. Around the same time, another passion was growing: music. Joe and Joey resisted it at first because wrestling had been their entire lives for so long. Eventually, they accepted that hip-hop was opening doors that wrestling wasn't. By 19, Joe stepped away from the independent circuit. Together with John, he and Joey focused on the group that would eventually become the Insane Clown Posse. And even then, wrestling never disappeared. Joe has often described ICP itself as a wrestling gimmick that became a rap group. The face paint, the characters, the ongoing stories, it all came from wrestling. As the music career took off, one of their first major purchases wasn't a car or a big house, it was another wrestling ring. They set it up inside a warehouse and wrestled whenever they had the chance. They had left independent wrestling behind, but they never stopped wrestling, and that passion unexpectedly opened another door when the WWF contacted ICP about recording entrance music for the Oddities. Joe responded with a question: "Do you know we can wrestle?" The WWF flew Joe and Joey to Stamford, Connecticut, where Tom Pritchard put both of them through a workout. Joe wrestled Pritchard, Joey wrestled Pritchard, then the two wrestled each other while Vince McMahon reviewed the footage. Not long afterward, ICP appeared alongside the Oddities at SummerSlam. The kids who had once waited behind Joe Louis Arena hoping for an autograph were now standing inside a WWF ring. For Joe Bruce and Joey Utzler, it felt like two paths they'd been chasing their entire lives had finally crossed. But before that, another idea was already taking shape. And it all started with a pile of grainy VHS tapes from Japan. By the late 1990s, ICP had become one of the fastest growing independent rap groups in the country. Music was paying the bills, but wrestling was still part of everyday life. The ring inside the warehouse was constantly being used. Joe and Joey wrestled during breaks, after work, and whenever they could. They never stopped looking for wrestling. Eventually, that search led them halfway across the world. Japanese deathmatch wrestling wasn't easy to find in the United States during the 1990s. Fans traded worn-out VHS tapes through the mail, bought copies at conventions, or tracked down collectors willing to duplicate them. Every generation of copies looked worse than the one before it, but none of that mattered. The matches were unlike anything airing on American television. Exploding barbed wire, fire, glass, crowds reacting in ways American audiences didn't. Joe became obsessed, but there was only one problem: everything was in Japanese. Instead of letting that ruin the experience, Joe and Joey started entertaining themselves. They turned the original commentary down, grabbed microphones, and started making everything up. Every wrestler suddenly had a different name. Every match had a completely different story. Promos were invented on the spot. Interviews that never happened were suddenly taking place. The more ridiculous it became, the harder they laughed. Joe has said they'd never sat down thinking they were creating a business. They were simply doing something that made each other laugh. Eventually, somebody suggested recording it, and that idea became Strangle Mania. Released through Psychopathic Records, the videos introduced Juggalos to Japanese deathmatch wrestling in a way nobody else could. The fans were watching the matches through the personalities of Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope, and the tapes caught on. Looking back, Joe has pointed to Strangle Mania as the first real sign that Juggalos would embrace wrestling as more than just another ICP side project. Most of the fans had never heard of the wrestlers, but they were buying the tapes because they trusted Joe and Joey. That success naturally led to another question. If fans would buy wrestling tapes, would they buy tickets to a wrestling show? And Psychopathic Records decided to find out. StrangleMania Live was booked at Detroit's St. Andrews Hall. The venue had already meant something to ICP. They had built part of their music career inside of that building, and now they were bringing wrestling there. The card featured names that fit the violent style fans had seen on the tapes. Among them were Madman Pondo and and Too Tough Tony, two wrestlers who would eventually become part of JCW's identity for years to come. The main event saw Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope climb inside a steel cage against the Chicken Boys. Joe had estimated the crowd at around 1,000 people. The building sold out. At one point, Shaggy climbed to the top of the cage before crashing down with a leg drop, giving fans exactly the kind of spectacle they had come expecting. More importantly, the audience stayed with the wrestling all night, and that was the real victory. Juggalos were not treating wrestling like something to sit through until the next concert. They were completely invested. Joe and Joey walked away from St. Andrews Hall, realizing they had something much bigger than a successful VHS series. They had proof that people would support a wrestling promotion built around their audience. Years later, Violent J has even questioned whether this should really be considered the beginning of JCW. Officially, the company wouldn't receive its name until later, but when he talks about the promotion's history, he often points back to StrangleMania Live as the first wrestling event Psychopathic Records ever promoted. In his mind, that's where the story really begins. The momentum continued almost immediately. Psychopathic partnered with Detroit area promoter Dan Curtis for another event connected to Hellfire Wrestling. Curtis understood the business side of wrestling in ways Joe and Joey were still learning. The second show sold out too. Then everything changed overnight. Dan Curtis would suddenly pass away the day after the event. Joe has said the loss stopped everything. For roughly 6 months, wrestling was put on hold while everyone tried to figure out what came next. When they finally returned, they came to one conclusion. If they wanted this company to survive, they were going to have to build it themselves. By then, they had already promoted 2 successful shows. They had seen crowds fill buildings. They had learned how much work went into putting an event together. They had also learned that there wasn't going to be anybody else steering the ship. If this was going to continue, it would be their responsibility. The promotion's first official name reflected exactly who was behind it: Juggalo Championship Wrestling. It sounded like something that could only come from Psychopathic Records. Their attitude carried over to the shows themselves. They weren't interested in fitting into somebody else's definition of professional wrestling. If a hardcore match belonged on the card, it went on the card. If a comedy match entertained people, it stayed. If a veteran could still captivate an audience, they wanted them there. The only question that mattered was whether the fans would enjoy it. 2 wrestlers quickly became part of the company's foundation: Too Tough Tony and Madman Pondo. Both had already been part of the Strangle Mania era, and both understood exactly what JCW crowds wanted. Pondo brought a willingness to do almost anything inside the ring. Tony connected with the audience almost immediately. Over the years, they became 2 of the faces most closely associated with the promotion. As word spread, more wrestlers started taking bookings. Some were local names looking for opportunities. Others had already built reputations on the independent circuit, and veterans who had worked everywhere from the territories to national television began accepting invitations as well. They wanted personalities, people fans would remember after they left the building. The company also started establishing traditions. Championships were introduced. Recurring events began taking shape. Rivalries would stretch from one show into the next. Little by little, fans stopped caring that ICP's name was on the poster. They wanted to know who would leave with the championship. They wanted to see how rivalries ended. The wrestling itself had become the attraction. Joe has said many times that he never dreamed of putting WWE out of business. He never talked about becoming the biggest wrestling company in America. His goal was much more practical. He just wanted JCW to pay its bills. If the promotion could support itself, he could keep running shows. The wrestlers would keep getting booked, and fans would have another place to watch wrestling. That philosophy shaped almost every business decision the company made. Money wasn't spent trying to look like a TV promotion. It went back into the ring, it went back into the production, and back into the next show. Around the same time, another psychopathic event was beginning to take on a life of its own: the gathering of the Juggalos. At first, wrestling was simply one attraction among many. Within a few years, it became one of the biggest reasons thousands of people made the trip every summer. The first gathering of the Juggalos took place in the summer of 2000. Music was the reason people bought tickets, but wrestling would become one of the reasons they kept coming back. They didn't treat wrestling like an opening act between concerts. From the beginning, they wanted it to feel like another headliner. Fans could spend the afternoon watching bands, then walk a few hundred feet and find a wrestling ring surrounded by a bunch of people. Every year, that audience grew, and so did JCW. The gathering gave ICP something most independent promoters never had: a guaranteed audience. Instead of hoping people would take a chance on an unfamiliar wrestling company, thousands of Juggalos were already there. The challenge wasn't getting them through the gate, it was giving them a wrestling show they'd remember. That freedom changed everything. They weren't answering to television executives. They weren't trying to satisfy sponsors. They booked the wrestlers they wanted to see. Some were legends, some were deathmatch veterans, and some were rising independent stars. If they believed someone could entertain a gathering crowd, they had a place on the card. As the years passed, those lineups became unbelievable. You had Terry Funk, Dusty Rhodes, Roddy Piper, Abdullah the Butcher, Sabu, Raven, Scott Hall, Mick Foley, Jim Duggan, Road Warrior Animal, the Iron Sheik, and dozens of others. Some would work only one appearance, and others would keep coming back. Violent J has often spoken about how much that meant to him. These were wrestlers he had grown up watching, and now they were working on his shows. One event stands above the rest in his mind: Legends and Icons. Years later, Jay has said he honestly believes it may have featured the greatest collection of active wrestling legends ever assembled for an independent wrestling event. He has challenged people to find another independent card with more legendary names on it. Whether someone agrees or not, it's really hard to deny the amount of history that walked through the curtain that night. Looking back, the event became even more meaningful. Roddy Piper wrestled one of the final matches of his career in JCW, and Kamala did too. They weren't marketed as farewell appearances. Nobody knew they would become that. Only later did people realize some of the last memories fans have of these legends came inside a JCW ring. Jay still speaks proudly about that. Those wrestlers trusted his company enough to spend part of their final chapter of their careers there. By this point, JCW had developed a reputation among wrestlers. The crowds were loud. They were unpredictable. If they liked you, they'd let you know immediately, and if they didn't, you knew that too. There wasn't much middle ground. Veterans appreciated that honesty, and independent wrestlers did too. Word spread quickly that a JCW audience wasn't sitting on its hands waiting for the main event. They reacted to everything. That atmosphere helped create another annual tradition, BloodyMania. As the years went on, BloodyMania became JCW's biggest event of the year. Major rivalries built toward it. Championship matches landed there. For many wrestlers, getting booked on BloodyMania meant they had earned a place on the company's biggest stage. Outside the gathering, JCW continued touring. Inside the gathering, it had become something much bigger than just another attraction. And despite everything the company had accomplished, Violent J still felt like the wrestling world was not paying attention. By the mid-2000s, Juggalo Championship Wrestling had the fans, but it was still struggling to earn its respect. Violent J has talked about that period more than almost any other, because in his mind, the company kept proving itself while much of the wrestling world looked the other way. And one story always comes back: the rave in Milwaukee. JCW packed the building with roughly 4,500 fans. For an independent wrestling promotion, that kind of attendance was almost unheard of. About 2 weeks later, ECW ran the very same building, and their audience was nearly identical. ECW's crowd became wrestling news, but JCW's didn't. Years later, Jay still tells that story, because he doesn't understand why one company received recognition while the other barely received a mention. That wasn't the first time he felt it happened, and it wouldn't be the last. Looking back, Jay believes much of it came down to perception. In music, ICP spent years hearing they weren't real rappers. When they entered wrestling, he felt the same thing happened all over again. People saw the face paint. They heard the word Juggalo. Many made up their minds before they even watched a show. Jay wasn't interested in trying to convince everybody. He kept running shows instead. Eventually, one of those shows led to a moment very few independent promotions have ever experienced. By the end of the 1990s, Vampiro had become one of WCW's biggest stars. At the same time, he had also developed a relationship with JCW. Years later, when asked how the famous Nitro appearance happened, Vampiro told the story himself. He remembered Shane Douglas throwing down the NWA Championship in ECW years earlier. Everybody remembered that moment. Vampiro wanted one of his own. Before walking through the curtain on WCW Monday Nitro, he picked up the JCW Heavyweight Championship. According to Vampiro, WCW simply told him to go to the ring, say a few words, and get some heat, so he decided to make a statement. Standing in the middle of a WCW ring on national television, Vampiro held up the JCW Championship and declared it was the only wrestling belt that mattered. Years later, he would have a laugh while remembering it. He said it was pretty punk rock. Millions of wrestling fans who had never heard of Juggalo Championship Wrestling suddenly saw its championship on one of the biggest wrestling programs in the world. There was no official partnership between WCW and JCW. Vampiro simply believed enough in JCW to put its championship in front of a national audience. For Joe, moments like that meant more than people probably realized. His company had gone from a backyard ring to dubbed Japanese VHS tapes to having its championship featured on Monday Night Nitro. Recognition still came slowly, but little by little, people were beginning to hear the name. Meanwhile, Joe was already thinking about something much bigger than getting recognition. He was thinking about how to make JCW better than it had ever been. After more than 20 years, Violent J wasn't interested in chasing the past. He wanted to figure out what the next version of JCW looked like. That meant paying attention to the wrestling business again. He needed to watch the promoters, and watch the production, and watch how successful companies present themselves. One of the people he found himself talking with the most was Brett Lauderdale, the owner of Game Changer Wrestling. The two developed a friendship through wrestling, and Jay has said they spent hours talking about the business. He admired what Brett had built, but more than the big crowds and the death matches, what Jay admired the most was the trust the fans had in the company. Jay has said he wanted JCW to reach that point someday, a place where fans would buy tickets before the card was announced because they already believed the show was going to deliver, and that's the reputation he was chasing. At the same time, Jay was careful not to just copy anybody. In one interview, he admitted he'd actually moved away from relying on death matches. He still enjoys them, and he still believes they have a place, but he no longer wanted them to define what JCW was. If a rivalry built towards a death match, great. If not, there didn't need to be one. Instead, Jay wanted stronger characters, better stories, and a show people would remember after they left the building. Everywhere he traveled, he paid attention. Working around MLW, he studied how efficiently their television was produced. He watched how interviews were filmed, how segments flowed together, and how little time was wasted. Appearances with AAA gave him another chance to watch a major promotion operate behind the scenes. But the experience that may have left the biggest impression came through Billy Corgan's National Wrestling Alliance. Jay has said being around the NWA motivated him. Watching another promotion build itself from the ground up convinced him that JCW could keep growing too. The next step, most people would look to sign bigger names, but not Jay. He was interested in creating new ones. Jay has often said his favorite part of wrestling isn't booking the matches, it's creating the characters. Sometimes an idea comes first, sometimes the wrestler comes first. Other times, an idea sits untouched for years until the right person walks through the door. He has talked about Mr. 50s as one of those characters. The gimmick sat unused for nearly 2 years because nobody felt right for it. Rather than forcing it onto someone, Jay waited. Eventually, the right person came along, and the character finally came to life. Cocaine took a different path. Jay has explained that cocaine wasn't the original idea at all. The character evolved after another gimmick failed to connect, and after a couple of cease and desists. Instead of throwing everything away, they kept experimenting until something clicked. That's how many JCW characters are built. Jay has compared the process to planting a seed. He gives someone the basic idea. The wrestler adds pieces of themselves. The audience decides whether it grows. That philosophy became the foundation of the company's rebuild. The next version of JCW wasn't going to be built from names from the past. It was going to be built around creating the next generation of personalities. And to make that work, the company needed something it had never really had before, a weekly show. For most of its history, JCW lived from one event to the next, a gathering show, a BloodyMania, a tour stop. Fans might wait weeks or months before finding out what happened next, and Violent J wanted to change that. He wanted a place where stories could play out every week instead of a few times a year, and that idea would become Lunacy. It was one of the biggest changes in the company's history. Instead of building everything around annual events, JCW finally had a weekly platform where wrestlers could develop, rivalries could unfold naturally, and fans could keep up with the promotion from week to week. For Jay, he was trying to build a roster, a real roster, not a roster that depended on legends from the past, one that could carry JCW into the future. That process started with the characters, and those characters would start shaping the entire roster. Characters like the St. Clair Monster Corporation, the Outbreak and Barnabas the Bizarre, Mr. JCW Kerry Morton, the Chocolate Juggalo Willie Mack, the Man of 1,000 Gimmicks Mosh Pit Mike, Richie Boy Briar Wellington, the Brothers of Funstruction, Caleb Conley, and many more would all become the faces viewers would associate with Lunacy. They all helped create a roster that looked nothing like ones fans remembered from the early Gathering years. And that's exactly what Jay wanted. He was building the new era of JCW, and the presentation evolved along with the roster. Years of touring with ICP gave psychopathic relationships with venues across the country. Many of them are clubs instead of traditional venues. Jay liked the atmosphere those buildings created: professional lighting, concert quality sound, and fans packed tightly around the ring instead of sitting hundreds of feet away. The shows felt different before the opening bell even rang, and those ideas came from years of studying other promotions. Jay borrowed ideas from all of them without trying to become any of them. Lunacy became the place where all of those ideas finally came together. For longtime fans, it was a different JCW than the one they had grown up watching. For new fans, it was simply JCW. And before long, someone with decades of experience writing wrestling television saw exactly what Violent J was trying to build. That man was somebody who was written for almost every major wrestling promotion and the brains behind the greatest wrestling magazine ever. That man was Vince Russo. By the time Vince Russo arrived in JCW, the company had already spent more than 2 decades finding its identity. The backyard days were long gone. The Gathering had become tradition, and Lunacy was giving the promotion a weekly home. And now one of wrestling's most recognizable writers was stepping into the picture. When I asked Russo what he thought of JCW before getting involved, his answer was honest. He hadn't watched it. As a matter of fact, he wasn't watching wrestling at all. After everything he'd experienced in WWF, WCW, and TNA, another wrestling company wasn't what brought him back. A person did, and that person was Violent J. Russo said he knew Jay was an artist, a writer, a creator. He believed the two of them could think the same way creatively. But more importantly, he believed there wouldn't be anyone standing between an idea and actually trying it. And that's what attracted him about JCW, the creative freedom. As Russo put it, there are no boundaries, and more importantly, no politics. For someone who spent years working inside the biggest wrestling companies in the world, that answer says a lot. Russo has lived through creative meetings, network notes, executives changing plans, writers fighting for ideas. He didn't expect to find any of that in JCW. Instead, he found something else: respect. When asked about what surprised him the most after arriving, he talked about the locker room. He said the amount of respect shown to him by everyone backstage caught him off guard. That environment made it easier to focus on what he believed JCW could become. When wrestling fans hear the initials JCW, many still picture nothing but blood, weapons, and hardcore matches, but Russo doesn't. When asked about what people misunderstand about the promotion, he answered immediately. He believes the biggest misconception is that JCW is built around hardcore wrestling. In his words, it's the complete opposite. He sees it as a company driven by characters and storylines, and that's exactly where Violent J had been steering the promotion. The death matches hadn't disappeared, they just weren't the centerpiece anymore. It was about the wrestlers, the stories, and the characters. If Vince Russo had to describe JCW, his answer would only take a few words: Attitude Era, circa 2026. Considering it was Russo who helped write much of the original Attitude Era, that's a comparison worth paying attention to. For Vince Russo and Violent J, their goal is to give people a reason to tune in the next week. Finally, we asked Russo what he hopes people remember when they look at JCW years from now, and his answer was one word: heart. For Vince Russo and many of us, that's what separates JCW. And after more than 26 years, the rest of the wrestling world was starting to finally recognize it. For years, Violent J felt like JCW was proving itself over and over again without getting much acknowledgement from the wrestling industry. His company has survived and toured the country and built a loyal audience. It had shared the ring with Hall of Famers and future stars. Still, when people talked about independent wrestling, JCW was rarely part of the conversation. But that slowly began to change. One moment stood out to Jay more than people might expect. The Wrestling Observer newsletter started publishing JCW results. To many fans, that probably sounds like a small thing, but to Violent J, it wasn't. Dave Meltzer had spent decades documenting professional wrestling. Seeing JCW listed alongside promotions from around the world felt like recognition the company had been chasing for years. JCW was finally being included. Another milestone came when Pro Wrestling Illustrated began recognizing JCW wrestlers in its annual rankings. Jay has said it's moments like that meant something because he grew up reading those magazines. Now the promotion he had spent decades building was appearing in the same pages. Outside of publications, JCW would also start getting recognition from independent wrestlers. More wrestlers wanted to work for JCW. The company would even get recognition on a major promotion, when Willie Mack would take the JCW Heavyweight Championship when he appeared in AAA, giving the promotion exposure in one of the most respected wrestling organizations in Mexico. Moments like that would have been difficult to imagine back when Joe and Joey were dubbing Japanese VHS tapes. One of the things Vince Russo hopes to accomplish in JCW is to bring as many eyeballs to it as possible. He believes more wrestling fans simply need to watch the product before deciding what they thought of it, and that's been one of the biggest changes over the last several years. More people have. Some discovered JCW through Lunacy, others found it through WrestleMania weekend appearances, social media clips, or word of mouth from other wrestling fans. However they got there, many realized the promotion was different than what they expected. By this point, JCW isn't trying to prove it belongs anymore. It's already earned that opportunity, because 26 years after its first wrestling show, Juggalo Championship Wrestling is still growing, still evolving, and still finding new fans. When people talk about the biggest wrestling promotions in history, the same names usually come up: WWE, WCW, ECW, and those companies earn their place. But so has JCW. It's not the biggest wrestling promotion in wrestling, but 26 years later, it's still here. More than a quarter of a century has passed since Joe and Joey promoted their first wrestling show. And during that time, the wrestling business has changed countless times. The Monday Night Wars came to an end. Promotions folded. New companies emerged. Streaming replaced pay-per-views. Independent wrestling found an audience that barely existed when JCW began. And through every change, JCW kept going. It kept growing. There were years when the business was booming, and years when the company slowed down. There were moments that forced Joe to rethink what JCW could become. But instead of holding on to the past, he adapted. He listened. He watched other promotions. He borrowed ideas. He created new characters. He rebuilt the roster. He found another direction whenever the old one had run its course. And a lot of it comes down to the one word Vince Russo used: heart. After hearing Jay talk about the company, it's hard to think of a better description. He has never measured JCW by TV deals. He's never talked about needing to become the biggest promotion. He just wants to put on better shows, find the next character, give wrestlers another place to work, and give fans another reason to come back. Those goals have stayed remarkably consistent for more than 26 years. Today, parents who grew up watching JCW are bringing their own kids to the shows. The faces in the crowd and ring will change. The champions will change. Professional wrestling always changes. But if the last 26 years have proven anything, it's that betting against Juggalo Championship Wrestling hasn't worked out very well, and that's something very few independent promotions can say. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out these videos just like it, and thanks for watching.